Hi, Sam. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm trying to stay warm, it's cold. It's January and it's cold.
Yeah, it's bitter. My family's from Minnesota originally, so I
Oh,
feel
that's
like this
cold,
is when
cold.
this is when my inner Minnesotan really shines because I get really like chilly at other times of the year, but for some reason when January hits, I'm like, this is what I'm made for. I don't know. And then the rest of the year, I'm like, ooh, burr, you know.
I love it. No, I mean I'm from like south of New Orleans, so this is like new territory for us. We don't know how to act. But I mean it's better
Yeah,
than sweating all the time, so I'll take it. But
true,
anyway,
true.
yeah, that's rough. But I'm really, really excited to talk to you today, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit more. But we're going to talk about your upcoming collection, The Poorly Made and Other Things. But if people don't know who you are, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sam Rebelein. I live in the Hudson Valley in what is technically downstate New York, but it's like all upstate from the city, you know. So I always say upstate, although I think someone in Buffalo would poo-poo that. Um, but I grew up in the Hudson Valley. I love it here, and so pretty much all of my work seems to be in some way a love letter to this area, whether it's the creepiness or the history here, because we've got a lot of like crazy overlapping chapters of history here in many different ways. But I'm a teacher. I work at a community college nearby. I work at the writing center there, helping people with their essays or job applications, resumes, scholarship essays, whatever kind of writing they're struggling with. Um, I love buffalo chicken wraps.
Who doesn't love a buffalo chicken wrap? Those are
Oh
the
my God.
best.
Yeah, although I got to cut back because now that I'm 30, it's really starting to do some permanent damage.
Oh, that's hard. That's real heartbreak, honestly. You should
Yeah.
that's a real horror story. Your next horror novel needs to be about breaking up with the buffalo chicken wrap.
Oh, the buffalo chicken breakup. Yeah, it's my my body horror rom-com. A romance between yourself and your own body. I mean, that's kind of a nice idea, actually.
I like it a lot. But
Yeah, we'll
okay,
back pocket that one.
I think you should. I absolutely think you should. So, I came to know you through your book Edenville, which released in 2023. Is that correct? Time's not
Yeah,
real to me
two.
anymore.
I
Yeah.
know it's like a year and a half ago almost already.
Yeah. And it was really funny because it was like I picked up your book when I was really like getting into horror, like seriously.
Hmm.
And I have never been really a cosmic horror kind of fan, and that novel has some cosmic elements,
Hmm.
and I loved it, and it kind of like opened up my eyes to like what cosmic horror could do. And I love that book for that reason because it just kind of changed a lot for
Oh,
me.
great.
And
Cool.
then your collection now, The Poorly Made and Other Things, has ties to that novel, Edenville. But whenever I was reading The Poorly Made and Other Things, I didn't feel like you necessarily had to have read Edenville to read this collection. It certainly
Hmm.
helped, and there was like a greater appreciation. But I thought that you did like a really good job kind of like filling in the blanks. Was that intentional to kind of like make it a standalone and there for the people who enjoy Edenville?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote The Poorly Made first, and the only reason it came out second is that and this is what they told me. So, when I got the deal with Harper, I had the collection and I had ideas for other novels and things that would exist in that world. And they were like, well, it's hard to debut with a short story collection, so we'll do whatever novel idea feels the most prominent. We'll do that first, like whatever you have mapped out the best, and that was Edenville. So Poorly Made was already kind of designed as a standalone for a long time, and then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, oh, it'd be cool to have these things kind of build. And there are Edenville doesn't really build on the Poorly Made and vice versa, but the novel that I just finished that will come out this fall, Galloway's Gospel, will certainly start to build a greater Renfield mythos that I think can't even think of a good comp, but there are like greater machinations happening in the world, and you get glimpses of those, but you're really following these like kind of narrow points of
Yeah.
view through like particular characters on the ground, so to speak. Those are the stories that I've always been really drawn to. Um, like a Marvel universe from the perspective of like just a dude, just a
Yeah.
dude who's like, well, shit, let's move out of New York City. This seems like a terrible place to be. Um, like I said, I can't think of a good comp right now, but those are the kinds of stories that I've always been drawn to. Um, so yeah, short answer being the Poorly Made was initially a standalone, and since then
Right.
it's grown sort of exponentially.
Yeah. And we'll kind of like revisit the timeline, I think, of whenever you wrote some of these stories and like how it all came together later. But it's really funny that you
Cool.
bring up the Marvel Cinematic Universe as kind of like an analogy, because one of the notes that I made when I was reading is just your world building, both in Edenville, but then in particularly, it's a bit of a broader view because it is a collection of stories. So we're meeting different characters and things like that. It's just so
Mhm.
damn impressive. Like, it's so
Thank you.
fun to see it just like flow out and in some ways come back together. What's that like? Like, I have to ask, like, do you have like a binder just full of like Renfield
Oh
lore
God.
that you have to like reference?
It's become easier. When it first started, it was one big notebook. And that was kind of my like desk wherever I brought that and opened it up. That was like, okay, now we're working on this world, and everything was sort of contained there. Now I have the PDFs for both Edenville and the Poorly Made open on my computer all the time. So I'm like, all right, whatever I can control F through this
Yeah.
document, like that's got to be the answer because now it's printed. So I'm like, okay. And in some ways that's so yeah, there's no like master file or binder or anything. I'm really like I just made a couple of days ago sort of a like funny pithy TikTok that was like I don't really have a process.
Yeah.
Like I'm not the person to ask, right? um but I do feel kind of um like insane in that way. Like I for the one that I'm working on now, I was like, okay, well, let's try going in with more of a plan, right?
Yeah.
Let's do the save the cat. Let's get some note cards out. Let's put some stuff on the cork board that I bought and don't use. Let's dig into it. And it immediately drove me insane.
Yeah.
So I'm just not the outliney master binder thing. And there's a lot of stuff that exists solely in my head. It's like, here's a point at which I'd like to arrive in like
Yeah.
3 books from now. Um, but those tend to be like the things that matter most to me are the sort of I don't know, like smaller feels like a weird word to use, but the smaller sort of like character beats.
Yeah, well, it's more of like
Um,
the interpersonal stuff that I feel like you write
yeah.
really, really well. And it does like it's some and the closest thing that I've read recently that I think of this way, honestly, is like with King and the Stand. You know, you're getting those
Oh,
interpersonal
sure.
relationships, and then like there's this obvious like way bigger world that you're slowly zooming out on. But to me, like in a lot of the stories in the Poorly Made, the dynamics between the characters and things like that, that's what keeps you hooked in reading because you're invested in them. And then it just
Yeah.
adds to this mythos as you go. I mean, and I don't know if you're a fan of Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but I just imagine it's like it's
Oh,
gonna be like
sure.
Charlie
Yeah.
Day at some point with the red string tying it all back.
Yeah. I mean, that was the initial pitch for sure. When we first got that meeting with Harper, and I had my like sweaty legal pad, and it was the middle of July, so like my arms were sticking to it, and I tend to get pretty sweaty for Zooms. Like it's
Me
something about
too.
like I'm shocked I'm not sweating for this Zoom. Because even the ones that you're like, oh, this would be fun or really low
Yeah.
stakes or whatever, you're still like, oh my gosh, I'm like kind of on.
No, I'm the same way.
That is good to hear that I'm not
Yeah, no.
alone.
You can
um,
literally ask any of my friends. My hands are always sweating.
so sweaty. Um, but yeah, so that was the initial pitch. Was very much the Charlie Day murder board. Like, here's all the connections, and it's funny because as time goes on, more and more I was like, oh, they're not really interested in that. What they're interested in is like, what's the next thing that we're going to publish, and how well is that going to do? If that does well, then we can start to look at the web. But but yeah, I was gonna say something else, but I don't know. That's my. I'll save more rambling for later. But
Yeah.
that's what I'll say about
Well, but
that.
it's really just interesting though, because whenever you read Edenville, you get the sense that everything is uncanny and everything is weird, and we're focused on for I don't want to say a small cast of characters because you do introduce a lot of characters in Edenville. But
Sure.
then whenever you have a collection, obviously that builds out and it's different parts of Renfield County that we're privy to, and so it really, really expands. And then your kind of anchoring point for all of these stories is like what I just like to call it's just like certified weird shit. Like it is just all of the
Yeah.
craziest things that you can imagine. And so I just wonder like how do you it's a bad question to ask like how did you come up with that? But like for lack of better words, like how did you? Because like quite frankly, from the reader standpoint, when you're reading, like you do not know what the next line is gonna hold because you pull some like
Oh
major
gosh.
punches off and things like that. And I'm just curious, like where do you find the inspiration for that? And like some of the more mundane aspects of life. I mean, you have a story about riding the subway home that's like punchy as hell.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the seeds for the stories in this collection in particular were just images that I saw, out and about. A lot of it was driving around the Hudson Valley. My first pro sale of a short story,
Hmm.
which I've been meaning to share because it's a January story, um, was gotten from an image that I had just driving around the Hudson Valley, and the tub from WAG was
Yeah.
very much, in many ways, the genesis of all of Renfield County, because I think I already had some of the like first inklings of the world in mind before I saw that tub. When I saw that,
Yeah.
that just like you just when you hear the first like paragraph or two of a story right away after seeing something, you're like, oh, that's the magic. That's what you hope for. Um, Otherwise, I think I'm just really drawn to worlds and stories that allow themselves to be as kooky as possible. Like everything has a bit. I
Yeah.
was a big fan of Rick and Morty.
Yeah.
Thoughts on the creators aside, like that show was very influential for me. In that, like even small bits will become, these they'll extrapolate an entire universe out of a tiny bit. Similarly, like Community, shows like that where
Yeah.
everyone has kind of a bit. And I really started thinking about that. There's a scene in, I think, one of the later issues of the Preacher comics,
Yeah.
where I think it's Jesse, the Preacher. I don't remember who's having this interaction exactly, but I think it's him. He's like trying to get information out of this guy, who's just like a random one off character. And as they're talking, the guy's like spitting out teeth. And I was like, that's
God.
fascinating that even a small character can have a bit that they do. And so
Yeah.
the more I thought about that, the more I was just like, well, everything can have a bit. Like, why not? As long as you have these characters that are sort of exposition devices. I mean, in many ways, the faculty in Edenville are
Yeah.
simply exposition devices in a number of scenes. And so why not give them like a weird little hand or whatever, Um, and I think there's a balance in that because then you get a lot of readers too who are like, well, I would like more of an anchor for the weirdness. It can't just be weirdness for weirdness's sake. But then I'm like, I don't know. We're still talking about Nightmare Before Christmas, and that was a whole town full of just
Yeah.
weird shit. So,
Well, and I mean to kind of like answer that though, there is a thread running through everything that you've written as far as like and I could be wrong in my assumption for this for Edenville and then with these stories about kind of like this cosmic existence for the universe. And this isn't a spoiler, this is just me like spitballing here. Like
no, this is
everything
great.
kind of like ties back to like a liminal space or a alternate dimension or alternate plane that we're not aware of, and like the in-between spaces as minute as our like in between our walls. So I feel like
Mm-hmm.
that's the anchor to me. And like that's the appeal of going back to these stories because I'm like, well, it's just kind of building on each other. And we got like a bigger part of that with Edenville. And then it's kind of teased to me a little bit more with your collection, but and part of like the cosmic horror aspects of it. But
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's like my anchor point is like, oh, the weirdness has a point. I mean, it's fun to just be weird for whatever reason. But I think that
Yeah.
there's, to me, that's why I come back to it.
Yeah, well, and the word that I try to use sparingly in this world is radioactive. I think at least once a book, it's just the Renfield madness is described as this sort
Yeah.
of radioactivity, and that like it will affect you in sort of unknown ways. It's always slightly different. It's always mutating
Yeah.
cells. In the same way that like Buffy would always face random weirdness because she lived on
Yeah.
a hellmouth. And the only answer you need is like, well, it's a hellmouth. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, great. So like this is the same kind of thing that um, but it's been gratifying too to have Poorly Made be out in the world because that to me is so much more of what Renfield means. Like
Yeah.
when I talk about that radioactivity and how it ties into these themes of depression and loneliness and everything that I was really going through when I was really in the middle of this book. That doesn't necessarily come across in Edenville. I think it's a much
Yeah.
more like Edenville's kind of an adventure story in some
Yeah.
ways. So it's been nice to sort of see like, oh, here's what I mean by that radioactivity.
Yeah. Well, and that's like the other thing that I did make a note of. It's kind of like this feeling of isolation, other outsiderness that you kind of touched on that kind of like picks up in each of the stories in different ways. And it's something that, I think my favorite story is My Name is Ellie. That one is
Oh,
my
great.
favorite one, just because it's just so whatever. But then my second favorite is, We Feed the Cats on Thursday, or We Feed the Cats
Oh,
every
great.
Thursday.
Yeah.
I love that one, and that's a big theme in that one. And that's
Mm,
just those are to me those two stories demonstrate the different ends of the spectrum that you're operating on because you have one that's really punchy and effective is just like you can pick this up and read this as straight up horror and
mhm.
it's just weird and it's gross and it's cool. And then you have this other one that it's like there's a slower dread that builds and like that something's not right and it's not outright said and then it just kind of builds and builds and builds until it's in your face.
Yeah.
Um and so I was curious like whenever you go to approach these things whenever you write them. I know that you said that it was kind of like a years long project of like writing these. Was that like intentional? Like is pacing something that you think about or does it just kind of happen naturally with these stories?
Um, oh God, I'd be such an asshole if I was like, yeah, it's just natural.
Well, no, but you
Oh,
have said before that you're not much of a planner, so I think that it's
yeah.
really interesting sometimes that whenever these ideas come to you, like they just kind of come fully formed. Like I've talked to plenty of authors who have said that.
I do think it's one of two modes. I think it's either that they really speak to you easily, and WAG was one that just came out like I saw
Yeah,
the tub and like I said, it starts talking to you and um so Cats was kind of like that. Cats, I sort of plodded along through because it's a longer piece. So it was,
yeah,
I think the first draft took me like maybe a week of just like sitting down each night and like, okay, kind of what happens next is this. But Ellie was very quick. It was like maybe two drafts of like I hear it really well, and so that is always the difference to me. Like if you can hear it really well, then that pacing does kind of come naturally because then I'm like, okay, Ellie is telling me this, or not just Ellie, but like I love being able to write a short story in the first person in general because then you're
yeah,
like, on the second pass, you're like, okay, what did this person not say? And
yeah,
that's where the real meaning is, like what is the stuff that Ellie's not saying, or the narrator in So My Cousin Knew This Guy, right?
yeah, 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 yeah. I love
So
that one too.
I think maybe that's what it is. Like the first person narrators in short form do come much more naturally because I think that's more honest when we hear someone like even hearing a significant other or your friends
Yeah,
like talk about their day and the way that they don't say things and the tone in which they don't say those things you're like oh okay all right um you know what I mean so I think that's kind of the difference for me is when it comes naturally and when it doesn't if I can hear that person really well then it's easy to follow and easy to figure out what is meaningful to them and how I
yeah,
can tie that into kind of a horror experience, which I think um, the two that come off the best of that marriage of the like the metaphor or the emotional experience and the literal stuff is Allison's face
Yeah.
and Glitch. Like Glitch, I think, was the earliest in this collection after WAG that I really finished. And when that came out pretty cleanly, I was like, oh, this is what I mean by writing horror, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I don't know how much of an answer that is.
Oh, well, look,
Like,
I'm all for like discussion and conversation. So if there's no straightforward answers, that's fine by me. And I kind
never
of want
with writing ever.
no, no, I don't. And and the thing of it is too is like whenever you pick up a book and you're reading it, you go in with somewhat of an idea of what you're going to be reading, right? And I'm sure for you, whenever you sit down, you have somewhat of an idea of what you're going to be writing, and then
Mhm.
it'll change. It'll morph into something else. And I think it's really cool to explore where things start and where they end up. And just, the whole process of from idea to here, especially with short fiction like this, and how
Mhm.
like in particular with yours, it's like my favorite X-Files like Monsters of the Week episodes where it's just
Oh, of
like they
course, yeah.
Mulder and Scully roll up to a strange town. The cops are weird, the pastor's weird, everybody's weird, and they don't know why, and then you get it. And that's like what every single one of these stories delivered for me. And that was just
Oh,
so,
awesome.
so
Wow.
fun to experience. So, and I'm so fascinated about the creator side of that, of like how you arrive there. But like you said, the smallest things like seeing a tub on a roadside and leading to WAG, that, I mean, it's how it happens.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it just depends on the kind of brain that you have and what that brain or soul or whatever feels called to, because I so many people are like, well, my son or my nephew or whatever wants to be a writer. What's your advice? And like, well, if he's doing it, then he's gonna do it. And that's, kind of advice that I am borrowing from R.L. Stein, who I got to see at an event a couple years ago. And that's what he said, that it was like, if no kid needs to be told to read and write books if that's what they want to do, right?
Yeah.
So if your kid is reading and writing and wants to tell stories and have stories be a part of their life, that's they're going to do that, unless something really big gets in their way, like taking care of a sick parent or whatever tragedy, whatever. But so I think that, as long as you feel the stuff talking to you, as long as you feel the tubs and whatever talking to you really easily, then all you have to do is keep following that. And it's when you don't follow it that you feel really gross and grumpy. But if you don't have that, then live your life, man. Go be free. If you don't feel the like, if you don't feel the constant pull of like, I should be productive, or I want to write or whatever, then you're free of that.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of younger writers, not necessarily, but like young on their path,
Yeah.
who um, don't necessarily feel that, but try to push against it because they're like, well, I want to be a writer. I'm like, but that's not what your brain is doing. It sounds like,
Yeah.
have the stuff talking to you, or whatever it might be, so
Yeah. I think it's partially, and I'm gonna go like armchair psychologist here for a second, but I think it's about like being present and being like receptive. Like sometimes,
yeah.
like you said, if you're too wrapped up in like, oh, I have to experience the moment for like the expectation of what it is, then like your brain shuts it off before you even get there. But if you're just kind of like in a mood and experiencing whatever's before you, then I find that's whenever stuff will come, and you're like, oh, I wonder what that's about. And then if you like write that down, and then you come back to it and flesh it out, then that seems to make more creative space than, the expectation of what you should experience.
Yeah, and it depends on how you express yourself too. Like being an introverted person, um it is, I think, what opens you up to, not like exclusively, but is one of the things that opens you up to being able to receive those things, because you are, I have been on sort of the fringes of a lot of like social gatherings
Yeah.
in my life, and that's how you learn a lot about people, right?
Yeah.
um, and then because it's like slightly more difficult to talk to people because of your introvertness, you're like, okay, well, I'll write a story instead,
Yeah.
and yeah, I don't know, not that I was like super introverted as a kid. I mean, I would like get into trouble at school, and like act out and stuff. Like there were other outlets for my creativity rather than just writing, but
Yeah.
it's always been a big part of it. And so I think that's kind of the high that I'm always chasing, because I have this image of coming home from school and it's the afternoon, and no one's using the family desktop, and so I can type out stories on that old clunky keyboard,
Yeah.
and so I think that's sort of where the kind of safety that my brain is always trying to get back to.
Yeah, that makes sense. And like I I don't know. I wouldn't describe myself as extroverted. I definitely think I'm introverted. But I know like I am not as introverted as I used to be. Like if we're gonna look at the
Sure.
sliding scale of this. And so I know in my days of being incredibly introverted, I was very observant. Like and you just take everything in. And because you're
Yeah.
thinking about like, oh, what I'm gonna say, what I'm gonna do, what I'm gonna whatever. But it's
Mhm.
interesting that you bring up because I would say that you're fairly extroverted, but I mean I'm judging that from your social media reels and your TikToks
Well, I
and
was going to say
everything
social
else.
media
Yeah,
changes everything,
it
right? Like
does.
social media, I think you always have to, there's always a moment before I start filming videos where I'm like, hey, everybody,
Yeah.
um, and it's horrible in public. If I'm doing it by myself in public, I'm like barely mumbling my way through it, because you're like, everyone knows you're like going for a walk outside and like trying to film a thing, and everybody knows what you're doing. And I find that like deeply embarrassing.
Oh,
Um,
I think you and I might be the same person then because I relate so much.
but you're doing the content and you're creating stuff that's like engaging with people really well, right? And you have like an evergreen bit, right, that you're doing, because you have the same sort of like um, stuff that you do, in the same videos, right? Which is the ideal, that you're like there's kind of a formula to it in anything
Yeah,
that you create, right?
it's like a pattern
Um,
recognition somewhat, you know.
yeah, exactly. So I think something about like doing that more. I don't know. Do you feel like it's easier the more you do it, or
Yeah, and like
not?
I'll be so honest. Like when I started doing this, and then like obviously I listen back to edit, like fix any hiccups or if there's like my Wi-Fi cut out or whatever, I would be
Mhm.
mortified. I would dread it. Like I'd get stomach ache, like because I hated hearing
Oh
myself
no.
talk. And it's gotten way better. Like I don't want to say it's fine now because I still like I'm not a fan of it, but it's gotten better. But it's really interesting that you say the same thing about you though, because like you're so funny. Like I genuinely
Oh,
enjoy
thanks.
seeing your stuff because it's genuinely hilarious to me.
Well, and I used to do comedy all the time. I was big into sketch comedy and improv, and I I was about to say I was a Shakespearean actor, but that makes it sound like way fancier. It's just like I was really into Shakespeare as a kid. My first role was as a fairy in Midsummer Night's Dream, and so and I was like 8, and it was this college production, and so everyone else was like 20,
Yeah, they're older.
and yeah, just the most gorgeous people I've ever, like, as an 8-year-old, seeing a like woman dressed up as Titania.
Yeah.
I was like, oh hi,
Yeah.
so like right away, Shakespeare and theater in general was fascinating to me. And then I did Shakespeare for years, and so most of my roles were sort of the comedic relief, or the clowns, or the fools. And that's also something that people should not forget about Shakespeare, is that the fools were often the ones who were allowed to be honest because they could do so in a way that wouldn't get them beheaded, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so that ties into sort of what we were saying about introvertedness, and that like
Yeah.
comedy does allow you to um, I don't know, illuminate things in a way that feels palatable. And horror, of course, does the exact
Yeah.
same thing. So I think it's sort of like chocolate and peanut butter.
Yeah. Well, and to bring it back to your writing, there were some
Oh,
moments
yeah.
in yeah. But for real, like I mean, I love hearing about authors as they are, but also I think that there's a reflection of that in your writing because there was a bit I think the first time I reached out to you was when I was reading Edenville and I thought like I thought of Succession and freaking what's his name?
Oh,
And I was like this character reminds me so much of him. Was that intentional? And like we made that connection about that. And when I kept reading, it was funnier because I had that like those aspects in my mind. And there were like moments of brevity and your dialogue was so great. And then again,
Mhm.
like in a collection, it's not as going to be as advanced as that because you're moving around a lot, but like whenever
Yeah.
what story was it? The my cousin, whoever, oh, so my cousin knew this guy. There are
Yeah.
moments of dialogue in that I was like, oh, like I just like you have to stop and laugh because it's like that's how people talk and that's how people are and they're that dismissive in that. Oh, it's yeah, it's whatever. My God, this guy just said that. So
Yeah.
you've nailed the horror of it, but like you said, the chocolate and peanut butter of it. I think they go well together, and it's a clear
Well,
expression of humanity whenever it goes like this.
that's really great to hear because I do think about that kind of thing a lot. That the narratives, because for a while I was like, I have to write my serious stories, and if I don't write my memoir and my stories about my life and relationships and all this stuff that I've struggled with and blah blah blah, then it won't feel right. And there was even a part of me that when Eatonville came out, I was like, this isn't right. This isn't the book that I meant to write, or something isn't right about this. Um, but more and more, then I was like, especially during the pandemic. During the pandemic, I wasn't going back and rereading fucking Crime and Punishment or
Yeah.
like, the most literary book that I try to reread kind of regularly is Catcher in the Rye, just
Hmm.
because because it's about change and growing up, it always sort of changes because your experience changes.
Yeah.
But the stories I was going back to were the stories that included that full spectrum of humor all the way to peril, right? Lord of the Rings is everything you need in the story. The the Goonies I just rewatched. That's
Oh
kind of
yeah.
a perfect, like the way that everything in that movie feels dynamic. The friend group feels dynamic. They've got their kind of gangly 12-year-old bodies, so they're bonking into things in the environment. The environment feels dynamic. Everything is so great in that. And again, full spectrum from humor to intense peril. So
Yeah.
once I started to realize that those are the stories that I felt drawn back to again and again, and I was like, okay, so we have to have both of those. Like we have to have the full spectrum from really kind, beautiful things all the way down to like immense brutality. Because that feels very human to me, and I think that we
Yeah.
all, whether we like to admit it or not, contain all of that within ourselves, right?
Yeah.
All the way from like, wow, I'm a really nice, charitable person. I rock. All the way to like, I suck. I'm such an asshole. I can't believe I have any friends,
Yeah.
because that's our whole experience. I think that the stories that we really love reflect that whole experience back at us in some way. So,
Yeah. That makes sense to me. And I with this collection, it's just there's a confidence to your writing and like just a full deliberate we're going there with it. And that was like really, really enjoyable to read. And part of the thing that you said, we can be the best or we can be the worst. So I have to bring up the body horror in this was
yeah.
truly like unhinged. I mean, I have to
What was
ask, like,
your ookiest? Oh, sorry. You ask me, and then I'll ask you.
no, I'm gonna answer that first. My ookiest one.
Okay.
Ugh, okay, let me think. I if I had off the bat, I mean, my name is Ellie is like really fun, but it's grotesque, but it's like okay, it's a little bit removed. But then whenever you get to like WAG, kind of got to me a little bit, and then my cousin knew this guy that was like, okay, yeah, that, and then Allison's face just kind of did me in. I think Allison's face is the one
Excellent.
that I was like, oh, okay. I think I was wincing for that one.
There's a couple lines in Allison's face that I cannot believe I got to keep. I cannot believe they made it through because you do, the stuff with your editor, and that's a couple rounds,
Yeah.
and then with this one we actually did 4 pass pages because we had a while after Eatonville, so we were
Yeah,
like,
that
okay,
makes
let's be
sense.
really thorough. And so I'm shocked that all of those rounds, like a couple bits in Allison's face, no one was like.
There's like a couple movies that come to mind. It's like this weird, and I don't think that it's a spoiler to say this, but like it's a little Texas Chainsaw. It's a little like
Mhm.
Pearl. I don't know if you've seen Pearl
Oh,
yet,
sure. I see
but
that. Yeah.
there's an element to like Pearl to that story. There's like I mean like I could probably think about this and come up with like five or six more, but there is something so signaturely, uniquely grotesque about that story. And then
Uh,
partially too, like with Glitch, because we've all been there where we hear a noise
mm,
and we're like, where is that coming from?
yeah,
And being, in that character's spot, that one kind of got to me in like in more of an emotional, psychological way, I guess, than the body horror. But they work hand in hand.
cool.
So, but
Yeah.
those are the ones. Was there like, did you have any particular inspiration for some of these instances of body horror, or was it just
Yeah. Was that the question you were
whatever?
going to ask too?
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
totally talked over you. Okay.
Oh no.
All right.
We can go back and forth because
Um,
I wanted to point out the ones that got to you eventually too.
well, I think now that you mention it, I'm big on video games. I
Yeah.
I love storytelling in video games, and there's so much violence wise that I think you can do in video games that you can't do in film. I've been
Yeah.
like um walking through hallways made of like suffering people still alive but like stitched together in a hallway in a video game, and you're just like, what the fuck? Like, they could never do that in film. Or like, just like random torsos on the ground or whatever. Like, so there's a lot of gore that you can experience in a video game, that you can't in like a film. It makes me sound like a psychopath when I put it that
No,
way.
but no, that's true. And like the proof of that is I'm watching Hannibal for the first time, and I am stunned and shocked that
Oh,
that show is on cable ever, because that's one of the few pieces that
yeah.
I feel like was able to go there with the body, in lack of better words, like art, like the violent art of it all, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a crazy one. I mean, wild that they got to show
Yeah.
some of that. But yeah, the especially for Allison's face, the main like triangulation of inspiration was Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2,
Hmm.
when he like holds the face up to the
Yeah.
light. Um, and Stephen Graham Jones' story, Solve for X. Do you know that one?
I haven't read it yet. Look, like behind me, I have like collected all of his stuff, but I just
Oh, you got the
haven't read it
wall.
yet. Like I've got
Oh man.
so much that I need to read still.
Well,
But
it's what is that one called? After the People Lights Have Gone Off
oh
is the
yeah,
collection that one's in.
I think I have
Um,
an original copy. Yeah, I do. I have the new printed copy and this one too, but I'm about to bookmark it so I don't forget it while you tell me about this.
oh, beautiful. Yeah, it's the last one in that collection, I'm pretty sure. So that one and Midsommar.
Oh
Those were the
yeah.
three sort of things that I had in mind, because Midsommar blew my mind. Like, uh, just the idea that the horrific forces could be so obviously horrific to everyone except the main character. That's something that I sort of got from Priya Sharma's work as well. Her collection, All the Fabulous Beasts, was a huge inspiration for this book, because she does kind of the same thing where you're watching this horrific thing unfold, and the main character or the narrator sort of comments like, yeah, they're just the blending of like eroticism and horror, or not even eroticism all the time, but just like how we can benefit from horror. I think there's something that like always gets me really excited about stories that do that, because that's always the question, right? Like, well, why do you like horror? And I can tell that there's a part of me that's like more anxious and more paranoid now that I'm a really big horror fan.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also something very calming about it, in many ways. So I think stories that kind of get at that weird intersection between catharsis and release, or acceptance, right?
Yeah.
Like being accepted by a group, um,
Yeah.
while also experiencing what is objectively like a terrible thing, or doing a terrible thing.
Yeah.
um, it's just fascinating to me.
No, that's really fascinating to me too, and it's interesting that you pick out Midsummer as an inspiration, because to me that when I think of that movie, I'm like, oh, that's horror in the daylight. Like that is
Mm,
like
mhm.
from a cinematic standpoint, when you look at that color palette, I mean, it's bright. There is not a whole lot of darkness, minus like a handful of
Yeah.
scenes. It is a very bright film, but it is memorably horrific. And so I think it's one of those things, like you said, horror is exciting whenever you look at it like on an emotional base level. Like everything is cranked up to 10. So it's not exciting in the sense of like, oh, I'm happy this is necessarily about to happen, but your fear goes up, your stress goes up, like everything's heightened. And so
Yeah.
everybody's always like, why is everybody into horror or, whatever. And whenever you are like a little bit anxious, I think it's reassuring whenever you can kind of like flesh out worst case scenario, even if it is like the most absurd worst case scenario you can come up with.
Yeah.
Um, it's nice to know that maybe you've read for a time how to handle that or what you would experience to like have somewhat of a guide through it. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing.
I was talking to a friend a few years ago. Driving around the Hudson Valley at night is a harrowing experience because the roads are so twisty through the woods,
Yeah.
and that was very much Detour too. Was just like my actual experience up until the weird stuff starts happening in Detour was like I was on this detour and there were people looking at their maps on the shoulder of the road, and I was like, oh fuck, this is it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but so I was talking to a friend. I was like, would you rather have you're driving down a forested road at night. Would you rather have one other car behind you to keep you company or no one there at all? Which is scarier to you? And my friend was like, "Oh, I like it when there's one other car with me because then I feel like I have some company. The stuff that really scares me are the monsters in the woods." And I feel the total opposite. The idea of
Yeah.
monsters proves to me that something otherworldly does kind of exist, which like my parents who dragged me to church for my whole growing up would be like,
Yeah.
like, look, miracles do exist. There's Bigfoot.
Yeah.
But the idea of like one other stranger in a car behind you just freaks me out so bad.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, it's like the devil you know versus the devil you don't, or like if
yeah,
it's the one car behind you, that could be like a psychotic individual, somebody stalking you, somebody with like deliberate pursuit. But I guess like the sense of wonder if you're by yourself, like yeah, is that scary? But there's still a margin of error that I would think that you're a little safer. Yeah, that's a good question, Ad. That's so interesting.
yeah. So I think that's maybe what an enjoyment of the genre gets at is like where are you most comfortable in sort of an isolated situation, and what can you imagine happening in that situation, and then find some catharsis in that catharsis for the fears that you already have, right? Because I was a very nervous kid,
Yeah.
um, and I wasn't active at all. Like I didn't really play sports, and then I started to like meet these kind of jockey bro guys who were like, oh, I can't sit through Human Centipede, it's too much for me. And I was like, well, I cannot throw a football, but I'll tell you what. So, some of those like early 2000s movies were kind of formative. Like I saw somewhere that the like anniversary release date of Teeth just
Oh
passed. Teeth is
yeah.
a big one, right? Any kind of movie that I could get through at a sleepover with kids who I thought were cooler than me, that was a transformative experience. Like when I first watched The Ring, and
Yeah.
the rest of the like slumber party was like, oh no. And I was like, boy, do I love that violin.
I feel like
um,
Ring is super formative for like, because I want to say, I was way too young to be watching that movie. I don't think that I did, but I think that my cousin who like babysat me a lot, I think that she saw it and she is not a horror person, but that was a movie that like everybody I feel like saw anyway. And she was
yeah.
so freaked out. I think she was supposed to be like house sitting and she had to end up going stay back with her mom. If I remember correctly, I could totally be making this up, but if I remember correctly, I think that's what happened.
Wow. Yeah, it's those formative experiences, man. Like whatever slumber party you're at, or like whatever older kid is like, are you gonna love this? Or you've never seen this, and you're like 9.
Yeah.
So that was big. Saw was huge for me in high school.
Yeah. I
It
remember going to Blockbuster and seeing like all the posters for Saw, and I'm like, who let people put severed fingers on
oh
a
god,
movie poster? Like they were just
yeah,
all hanging out.
teeth and
Yeah.
like all kinds of random shit. Yeah. I've tried to like sort of self-diagnose my interest in Saw. I think it's it inspires a relationship with your body, which is maybe why so many teenagers are into it, that like
Yeah.
your body is changing in ways, and maybe that it's worthwhile to rewatch now that I'm 30 because the same thing is happening. But you're like your body is developing in these new ways that are kind of scary and kind of new, and so there's again some comfort maybe in being like, oh well, if I had to, like in the same thought process that I'm like, okay, if I had to, I could stop eating buffalo chicken. It would really suck, but like that, but I could do it. In the same way, you're like, oh, I bet I could twist my hand off in
Yeah, I
order
could get out of that.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, that's just something like very 15-year-old about that experience to me. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I get it. And I think it's hilarious. Like, I swear to God, I was just thinking it and you said it about the buffalo chicken reference. That is startling. Oh my God.
Yeah. For years, you've been eating buffalo chicken. Um, I don't know what my trap would look like. And a friend of mine have an ongoing bit. A friend of mine and I have an ongoing bit about like the disparity between some of his traps. Like sometimes he's like, you cheated on your wife, and now you have to dig your way out of a tub full of glass. And then sometimes it's like, you have to hug all these stuffed animals or whatever.
Yeah.
The sometimes the traps are really intense
Yeah.
compared to the crime committed and
I was
stuff
about to
like
say the crime and the punishment equalization on those is hilarious. Like you parked shitty at Walmart one time. Now you have to stick your hand in
that.
this
Yeah,
box. Yeah.
yeah. Oh my god. Yeah.
Oh.
Whatever. But yeah. What else can I answer about the book? I feel like we like keep sort of poking at it and then talking about other stuff. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's kind of like what your stories did though. Like they were all about like a lot of different things, but then they came back, like I said, there's the central theme about somewhat isolation and otherness. And you have the one big thing that I really, really enjoyed about this collection, and it just could be that I haven't read that many collections that have done this, is like you do have a thread of narrative that runs all the way through that ties the presentation of these stories together, right? Like we're presented in the very beginning and in between every story with a break of exchanges between two characters that explains what's going on and why we're reading these stories. And to me, that was really, really interesting because it gave context as to where these stories fit into the greater scheme of things and all that good stuff.
Mhm.
Like, when did you decide that you would do that? Because, like, you can just have a collection of stories. Like, you don't necessarily have to do that, but I thought it was really cool that you did.
Yeah, well, I love, again, I think that's something that film is way ahead of books on, because people love an anthology in film, but then collections tend not to sell as well, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm a huge fan of Trick or Treat.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
like I just love Trick or
It's a
Treat.
fun
I
one.
love body bags, and All Hallows Eve really freaked me out. And the fact that Art the Clown is now like an international sensation is like
Yeah,
not totally cool with me. Like
yeah,
I would never judge anyone, whatever. But Terrifier is one of the very few horror things that I'm an absolute no on.
yeah. I'm
So
not a huge fan of it either.
yeah, I got through the second one and they were like, don't worry, the third one's going to be even worse. And I was like, that's not.
I don't know that
um,
that should be the tagline for anything
yeah.
really.
Yeah. Yeah. But the All Hallows Eve is great. What is that one called? The Mortuary Collection is a really fun one. I highly recommend that one. I think that one's kind of an unsung hero in anthology horror. The
Yeah.
the Mortuary Collection. Great soundtrack too. But but yeah, so I just kind of wanted to do that with something in book form. And I guess that's kind of the image for your like much earlier question about like the big world beats. Like the big world
Yeah.
beats, I kind of have mapped out, but then the lore and the history I have no head for. So I'm always like what year did I say that thing was? You know, um, but then the like smaller character beats, I also like have very solid in my head, and I think
Yeah.
that's also born out of a love for Trick or Treat because um, the character of Sam is our through line, like weaves through
Right.
these different stories. And so I just love the idea that, and it's a beautiful moment where he and Rhonda, like no spoilers, but Rhonda's just done something nuts. And and we root for her kind of to do it, which again is like sort of midsommerness of it all.
Hmm.
Um, but she and Sam kind of nod to each other and then go their separate ways. And so I think
Yeah.
that's an energy that I wanted to really bring into the world, that there are just kooky things happening all over. And you could have monsters who are dragging bodies into the woods, happen to be at the same time of day, and just nod to each other and have nothing to do with each other. And um, it's again gratifying to have this book be out because I think people get to see that on a bigger scale. You know, with Edenville, the scale was kind of small. So for me, like um, Quinn's missing friend Celeste,
Yeah.
I have no answer to. She's
Hmm.
gone in the mist. And there's something kind of true crimey about that, where I'm like, you know, I think my favorite sort of urban legends and ghost stories and true crime stories are ones that end with just like, we'll never know.
Yeah.
So, um, so it's been, but having just that little subplot be unanswered, I think didn't quite grok for a lot of readers. So to see like another full book of unanswered questions, we're like, oh, okay, this is just kind of the landscape that like
Yeah.
Quinn is lucky that she got out, and that's kind of
Yeah.
her emotional journey, that she's like, fuck this place, then I'm out.
Yeah.
And accepts the lack of answers. But that is something that Rachel Durwood will really struggle with, because she also is going to be the hero of the novel that I have coming out in September.
Oh,
Um,
really?
so she
Oh,
she drives out of this collection right into the next book. Um,
yeah.
and so that will be sort of her emotional journey as well. Like, how do we um, grapple with the search for answers and meaning? And I think that's something that we all struggle with, like, especially today. We're recording
Yeah.
this on Inauguration Day, which even feels gross to say that this is Inauguration Day. But that like just that constant like, well, how could you vote for him, right?
Hmm.
Like, how could you do that? Like, even that like uncomprehension of something terrible um, is what pervades Renfield County and will carry Durwood through the next book. It's like,
Yeah.
how can we find answers, and how can we hammer out meaning um, and stop evil? And whether she does or not, you'll just have to stay tuned.
Stay tuned to find out. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's an interesting point though, because it's like almost a look at obsession as well, right? Like
Mhm.
getting obsessed with finding answers, even if there's none to be found. And like one of my favorite things that I think I've had to come to learn growing up is like you're not gonna know. There's things that you're gonna have to just kind of accept. And like
Yeah.
not every mystery is yours to solve. Like, because I'm
Oh,
somebody
sure.
who wants to. I want to know, but you don't, it's not necessarily your job to. And maybe one day the
Yeah.
answer will come and it may not come at the time that you're thinking, but you don't have to punish yourself or stress yourself to find the answer now. And so I think, for Rachel's character coming out of this collection and into the next book, I think that, she has kind of like that thread of obsession, as you'll see, and for the people who read Poorly Made, as it unfolds and you see the timestamps and like the formatting of the book and things like that, you see like she's kind of like a dog with a bone. She's not gonna let it go.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to see what that looks like in another installment, and like what shape that takes.
Yeah. The next book, oh my gosh, this is like the most I've ever talked about it. So this is really exciting.
I'm so excited.
But
Okay.
this is exclusive. Um, but it's already like technically you can already pre-order it on Amazon. So I feel like I'm not talking totally out of school. But she now I got so excited I forgot what I was gonna say. but oh, so yeah, she does become kind of a like superhero in the next book. A big it's a good word, like a big influence for this next book was Men in Black, just in the,
Yeah.
again, a world that is like you walk by kooky stuff and you're like, what the fuck? And it doesn't matter. You go on to the next thing. Um, and so she sort of exists in this Men in Black space of like the Men in Black of the Renfield County. And so
Right. Okay.
she's that dog with a bone feeling is going to be tenfold for her in this one, I think. And she really gets to shine, which is really fun because she's like very contained in the unfolding of a manic episode in this book. And so
Yes.
she she comes down and it goes from there. But so that was really cool because um it started, the stain, the interstitial
Yeah.
chapters were, it was its own story. And then I was like, oh, this doesn't have a plot. It was just like a weird, like, I told the story of the Renfields and how they all died,
Right.
and then it affected the county. And then it sort of like the first person narrator revealed themselves, and then she was talking about herself.
Right.
And I went through many drafts of that while I was doing my MFA, and this was my thesis. And finally, my professors were like, well, you have to have some kind of emotionality throughout the whole thing. Like there has
Yeah.
to be something at stake for her from the beginning, or we don't necessarily care. Um, so then it all started to come together where I was like, well, I have this landscape where I sort of picture everything being creepy, and I have this thing that makes everything creepy, and she's kind of a part of that. So I don't know, it just started to come together. And
Yeah.
then um, it was much more like ethereal and loose originally. It was like
Hmm.
one email that she was sending split into segments, and that didn't really make sense. And so it just really morphed over the course of like 6 or 7 years
Yeah.
to become what it is now. So it's her. So point being, she has lived in my head a long time in a lot of different iterations, and to see her story kind of come to a head in the next book, Galloway's Gospel,
Yeah.
is going to be really really cool for me. So
Yeah. I have to say, even though this is the first time you and I actually like speak, not on social media, it is like rather
yeah.
very like it's gratifying, like because I can see it in the way that you talk about it, and like also the way that you've written about it in your afterword, like the
Mhm.
reverence that you have for the setting and these characters and this time that you've spent on this. Like I wouldn't want to call it a project because that's too small, but for lack of a better word, I mean that's it kind of covers everything because like you said, you had all these stories that you had written and you wanted to put together, and then you were like, no, we need to do Edenville first. And so
Mhm.
seeing it kind of come in this full circle way, it's like it's really cool to see that, knowing that hey, it wasn't Edenville poorly made than this. Like it's a
Yeah.
cool cycle.
Yeah, well, and there's stuff that the because I always have new ideas and there's always stuff brewing. The way I get writer's block is like I just don't give a shit about any of it. Like I'll write, like I'll be able to write a bunch of words and then I'll look back at it and I'm like, I don't care about any of this.
Yeah.
And then I get stuck. But it's been funny to a lot of these ideas have existed for years in my head, and now that Renfield County feels solidified, there's a lot of like, well, how does this fit into the mythos? And
Yeah.
Galloway's Gospel was that for a long time, that it was this kind of standalone story. And I had this like you said, dog with a bone detective in mind, and somehow that became Rachel Durwood, and then
Yeah.
like I knew that there would be weird creatures in that novel, and then at a certain point it was like, well, I have a whole county filled with weird creatures over here. So I don't know, it's just like it's cool to see all these old ideas kind of come to fruition and also
Yeah.
fit together. um, and I kind of wanted to do something more like specific than some of King's mythology. Like,
Yeah.
there are certain beats in some of his stories where they're like, and over there is Derry. And as a reader,
Yeah.
you're like, oh, but there's like not much more to do with that, Um,
Right.
and there are, two is like, not to poo poo whatever, like there are really solid connections that are really fun, like that moment in the I'm forgetting the numbers, 11
Oh,
23 60.
2263,
Yeah.
yeah.
It
When
was
he's
like
in Derry.
1782. Yeah, right.
It's
So like
hard.
that.
Yeah.
So like that's a fun bit, but like what can we do more with that to have like the two narratives depend on a moment
On
like
yeah.
that, you
Yeah.
know?
And I mean, I won't lie. I mean, I'll say like I thought of it, like whenever I read Edenville, I'm like, oh, this is very, and like, I listen to like the Losers Club podcast. So anytime they find connections, they call it like King's Dominion. And I was like, this
Yeah.
all feels very King's Dominion because it's very, some of it's referential, some of it's not. Like you said, you can have the monsters who nod in the woods and go their separate ways and it means nothing. And
Mhm.
that's kind of, somewhat the way that some of King's stuff works. But
Yeah, that's
it
true.
it goes back to the character work too, though. Like when I mentioned with the stand, it's not like you're just writing about this maximized weird shit from the sky. You're writing about it with people that you characterize and make relatable and have, suffering and issues and you're along for the ride with them. And that's what makes horror good. That's what makes it captivating.
Mhm.
So I think that's how you get to tell these bigger stories on a smaller scale.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of video games again, I'm a huge fan of The Last of Us Part Two, which
Yeah.
is very much that mode of storytelling where
Yeah.
you are viewing a massive story through a tiny lens, one piece at a time. And there are pieces of dialogue and things happening as Ellie, when you're playing as Ellie, that the first time around, you don't even clock. And
Right.
it's not until you get Abby's side of the story that you're like, oh, okay, cool. Um, and so I just love that a lot. I love that kind of storytelling where you have to kind of revisit it and re-explore it. Um, and so yeah, that was a big influence for me as well. The Last of Us, particularly The Last of Us Part Two, was very much in mind when I was writing Edenville. The
Yeah.
Poorly Made was pretty much done by the time that game came out. But which is already almost 5 years ago.
No.
Oh my god.
No, time is not real. Time is absolutely
Yeah.
not real. But no, I really love it, and I definitely get what you mean. I think whenever stories are that multifaceted that you can walk in a complete like 180 degrees and read a similar story, not the same story, but from somebody else's perspective, and you get like a
Yeah.
different narrative is really, really fascinating, or a different take, a different, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for it. I would love, part of my question, and you've already answered it, is like, what's next? Are we going to be staying in Renfield County? And I'm really, when I tell you the book that you have coming out in the fall sounds like it was written for me, oh my God, I'm so excited about it. I'm so pumped. It sounds amazing.
It's gonna be fun. So I don't know exactly how old you are, but it's gonna be big 2009 nostalgia.
Oh
My
God,
playlists.
that was like peak middle school, like got an iPod Touch, like thought I was hot
Ugh.
shit time. So
Yeah, yeah. The playlist I was listening to while writing it was all My Chemical Romance
hell
and
yeah.
Fallout Boy,
Perfect. Perfect, perfect,
Paramore,
perfect.
pulled
Oh,
out all the
say
stops.
less. Say less.
So it's fun, and it ended up being, and I haven't watched your thing with Clay yet, but I'm sure he said something similar because because I had the idea a few years ago, and the idea is really that this cult, this accidental cult, takes over this town, and the fact that that became a very prescient thing to write about this year
Oh yeah.
is just kind of crazy, and the same kind of conversation went on with Paul Tremblay when he published
Oh
Survivor
yeah.
Song.
That's true.
Right? They were like, well, how did you like know the pandemic and blah blah blah, and he was like, I this was finished for me a year before it came out, right? So like,
Yeah.
um, so anyway, but yeah, it's this girl. She's in high school. She's bored in class, and she starts drawing these creatures. And the kind of like, he's kind of cute, but he's kind of creepy. This guy sitting behind her. He's wearing that classic like Heath Ledger Joker shirt, right? That every boy had like 08, 09. Um, and
Amazing.
he thinks that these creatures are real, right?
Yeah.
And it sort of because he's paying attention to her, and then other people are paying attention to her, and then she kind of like bullshits a class project because of this, and so it just spirals out of control into this big cult. Um, and we cut between her story in 2009 and Rachel Durwood in 2019, who is getting wind of this cult town, and has to somehow put a stop to their doomsday. This is a really abridged version, but that's basically the bit that we have these two women. They're both named Rachel, but they're not the same person. They're totally different people. Because I was like initially, I
It's
think
her all
because
along.
yeah, well, because so many thrillers do that, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like, and Clay asked that as well. He read an early version of it, and I was like, "That's funny," because that's what. Well, uh, I was about to spoil something really bad. I should just said it. But because that's the trick that people so often play, I wanted to really be clear. Like, no, these are two different people, and because their names are both Rachel, Rachel Durwood is really like, oh, I should do what I can to help this
Yeah.
girl
Yeah, she
because of the weird
identifies.
coincidence of her names.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but writing those 2009 chapters and just this big ensemble cast of like caricaturized townsfolk falling
Yeah.
for this like ridiculous um, cult faith, was really a lot of fun.
It
So
sounds like
it's
so much fun. Oh my gosh. I've said it a lot this year for like a few different things. I was like, I'll give a kidney for that. And nobody's come to claim my kidney yet. So it's still up for grabs. I would give a
all
kidney
right,
for that right
listeners.
now. No, that sounds amazing. That sounds so awesome. Oh my gosh, that's so much to look forward to. Is that coming out with William Morrow as well?
Yep. So that'll be
Okay.
William Morrow in September, and then
September.
they we are under a two-book contract. So I'm working on something that is kind of a standalone,
Okay.
and will be a much more like straightforward thing. For all the people who are like Renfield's too much. Boy, are you in luck. um, but after that, I pitched some stuff to my agent that I can't say more about. But I do have the stories that I care the most about are the continuation of the Spine and
Oh
Jack
yeah.
Lanigan. So
Yes, yes.
um,
Okay.
yeah, I'm really excited to get back to that character. So there are a couple more Renfield things coming for sure,
Hmm.
and even the standalone is kind of set in that landscape. But hopefully, at some point soon, I'll get to go back to my true passion, which is worms in outer space.
Hell yeah. No,
um,
man. Oh, I love it. Oh, I love it. I love it. I love it so much. Okay. Well, I've taken up an hour and 11 minutes of your time. Um, is there anything else that you wanted to mention or bring up about Edenville, The Poorly Made, any of your other projects or like any upcoming events that you want to plug?
No, the fact that I got to talk about Galloway's Gospel is great. Just to reiterate, you don't have to. So far, you can start your Renfield County journey at any point. If
Yeah.
you pick up Galloway's Gospel in the fall, that's your first Renfield County novel, that's fine. Um, it will, I think, mean more to you if you have read The Poorly Made first, because it's the same character, but not necessary. And be interesting to hear your thoughts. If you're a person who reads The Poorly Made and then Edenville, it's kind of the way it was intended,
I
for
have I
me.
have a
So,
perfect test audience person for you to do that because I know somebody who has an arc and they were like, "Oh, I need to read Edenville first." And I was like, "No, no, 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 no. I want
mm,
you to like read this now. Like you have to read this now." And if I can convince them to do it, I think I might be able to get some feedback for you.
okay, perfect. Yeah, because there's some things like the Edenville Butcher, like how does your experience of that weird character change if you've done the poorly made first.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the particular things in Edenville that was really like, oh, what is that? What the fuck? But if you read poorly made, then you're like,
Oh, yeah.
um, um, so yeah, it just is like exciting and really interesting to hear the different takes. In terms of stuff coming up, I mean, Galloway's Gospel, I'll be really excited to talk about more. I think that's the only other thing that I really have to plug. If you're going to be at AuthorCon
Yeah.
in Virginia, in Williamsburg, Virginia, come find me. I don't have a table, but I am going to bring a huge backpack full of poorly mades. So feel free to buy one and get it signed. Um, and some amount of proceeds will go to Scares That Care.
Yep.
Great. I almost call it scholarship. That's not the word. So come on, brain. Let's
Is it, are they considered a charity?
charity.
Charity.
Jesus, yeah. I was like scholarship fundraiser. Oy vey.
No.
Yeah, the great charity. And I'll be at StokerCon, of course. I'll be at Horror on the Rappahannock, which I think is in
Mm,
May.
yes.
So and other things that I've planned that I'm spacing on, because if this brain can space on the word charity, it'll space on what I
Well,
planned.
I mean, if you think of anything else, I can always put it in the video description and the podcast descriptions. That way people can see for their for event stuff. I know like a few people are going on book tour and all, so I didn't know if you had anything like that planned, but
No, for Poorly Made, I do want to plan a bunch of stuff for Galloway's Gospel, and I think it's a
yeah,
bit easier because it's the novel.
that makes
But
sense.
for
Yeah.
yeah, for Poorly Made, try to keep it a little light. But we're doing a launch, excuse me, with Stanza Books in Beacon, New York,
Yeah.
with Clay McClaw Chapman. Um,
Love that guy.
and I want to think of something fun to do that's not just like we read and then do a Q&A and like converse with each other, but I want to like, because I got to read his book, which is next on my TBR, but I want to like come up with trivia questions for him about it, like how well do you know your own book or something like that.
There are a
uh,
few things I feel like if he just showed up, like dressed a certain way or like with a certain item, that he would fall out. Like it would just be such a surprise for him.
yeah, he's such a sweetie. He's like,
He's horror's
yeah.
bigger, like biggest cheerleader, I think, is like the best way that I think of Clay. And like I, whenever he did the launch with Emily Hughes for Horrors for Weenies, and he dressed up as a hot
Oh,
dog and ran around, and
oh yeah,
that was
yeah,
so funny. I wasn't there, I just saw it on the internet, but it's so funny.
yeah. He's so sweet, and like, because I'm like kind of a, I really, and you and I have talked about Seinfeld before, but
Yeah.
more the older I get, the more I'm like, oh, Seinfeld really speaks to like, like so much of my personality is like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't know. And so every time I try to like get Clay to engage with a little bit of like assholery like that, it bounces off him like nobody's business. He like, I'm like, all right, but are you really happy with all your audiobook narrators? And he's like, it's an art form. I couldn't do it. They're great. I'm like, rats, you know? He's better than me again, a better person. Which isn't to say I love my audiobook narrators. That's a bad example, but
Oh, no, no,
um,
no. I know what you mean though.
yeah.
No.
Yeah, anything you want to plug? I guess this is your podcast. You can plug whatever.
No, we're here to talk about you, Sam. God, you and to be honest, you and Clay have a lot in common because whenever I do have him on, I've had him on twice, and I've had to like twist that man's arm to talk about his own freaking books. Like it was like a hostage negotiation to be like, no, we can't talk about Nad's book. We have to talk about yours. Like we have to stop talking about Paul Tremblay now. Like let's talk about Wake Up and Open Your Eyes.
I
No, he
know.
made the
Yeah.
joke whenever I had him last time that I was going to be a therapist to all of the horror authors and help them work through their
Oh.
issues, and we were going to get to the root of why Paul Tremblay loved ambiguity so much. So, yeah. Good times had by
Nice.
all. But thank you so much, Sam. I know I've enjoyed this conversation immensely. I've enjoyed reading your books and I love getting to chat with you about them. I'm really happy for you learning the background of these stories and like how much time you've sunk into them to see them come to light this way. I think that from everybody that I've talked to, they have loved The Poorly Made. So I'm excited
Oh,
for everybody to get their hands on it in I think 2 weeks, 2, 3 weeks, something like that. 3 weeks.
yeah, yeah. Whatever math feels right to you is the correct answer. Three weeks from tomorrow, everybody, you can
Okay.
experience a real downer of a book. I think that people seem really energized by. Um, but no, the response to Poorly Made has been really cool and really gratifying in many ways because Eatonville, like, I wrote it because I had to, right? Like
Yeah.
they bought it and I had scraps of it, and I was like, ah. Um, and Poorly Made was leisurely and literary, and so the fact that that's getting an even, like, Edenville got a warm response, but the Poorly Made is getting like a hot response, and so
Yeah.
to see that difference is also really, really, validating in many ways. So
Good.
um, so yeah, and also, can I just say, like, I had a really cool, and this is for all you writers out there, and also for all you fans, because I this has been something that like took me, and this will be the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let you go,
Oh no.
because I've also
I
taken
don't
up 80 minutes of your time.
I don't have
Uh,
anywhere to be. Do you have anywhere to be?
no, I just have a Cobb salad to make.
Not
But
buffalo chicken wrap. Damn.
I know. I'm trying to be good. I'm trying to be a better man. But no, so I was sitting outside on New Year's Eve, and I was like answering messages from Instagram. And because I'm an introvert, sometimes I get easily overwhelmed by all the stuff on my phone.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I gotta text this person back, I gotta write that person back, and it really struck me like, well, this is correspondence that I have with fans. Like, the only reason that, like, you and I are talking, or the people that I was writing back on that day, are because they reached out because they read my work and liked it. And that just kind of took a moment to sink in, where it's like not the job of doing social media stuff, or like, having to answer emails. Like, it's a different thing. It's the fact that, like, I got to talk to you because you're a fan is like, that's so crazy to me, and like, I think because the lines of communication have, like, like, it's so easy to be a fan and
Yeah.
reach out now that it's hard to, like, really let that sink in. So that's why I say, like, for all you writers out there, who might feel similarly, we're like, oh my gosh, I got all these Instagram messages, I should respond to. There's no shoulds about it. Like, that's a cool fucking thing. Like, this is really cool that I get to be here. So, like, when you're like, I took up an hour of your time, like, please. um, and for all you fans out there, like, the vice versa, right? Like, the fact that you get to reach out to authors and have them respond, like, take a moment and, like, fucking appreciate that. Like, that's not even something that we had when we were kids. Like,
Yeah.
authors were nebulous nothing to me. And now I, like, if I wanted to, could reach out to some of those people that I read when I was 8 so easily, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's crazy. So, like, just take a moment today, horror fans, and like, appreciate the fact that you get to be in that. That's pretty damn cool.
It is pretty
So
damn cool. That's how this whole gig for me started, was the ability to do that shit. We
oh
wouldn't be here
yeah.
without that. So no, I'm very grateful for it. And I know it's a double-edged sword because the accessibility sometimes is not, the best. But I for one am very grateful. And I'm very grateful that you made the time to talk to me today about everything that happens in Renville County. But yeah, thank you so much, Sam. Poorly Made is out on February 11th with William and Morrow. And until then, and I'll hopefully talk to you again in the fall, maybe, about
uh,
your next book.
Absolutely, it would be a true treat for
Okay,
me.
well, we'll
So
get it on the books eventually, but until then, thank you very, very much.
yeah, thank you.